Good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here in Miami at the Biltmore. I want to express my gratitude to Daniel, to Juju, to Carlos Diaz-Rosillo, and to all this distinguished audience that is joining us this morning. I am here today because this is a day that is going to be devoted to speak about environmental resiliency, to talk about the green economy, the blue economy, and also how this combines with the idea of building sustainable cities with high amounts of economic growth and the generation of prosperity. So I would love to show some images to put this framework before your eyes. I don't know if the production can help me here. The concept that I want to share this morning is biodiverse cities. How cities can shall protect biodiversity, and how cities shall take advantage of biodiversity as an asset and not, as it was wrong thought for many years, as a liability. Biodiversity is an asset, and the protection of that biodiversity will determine how cities will succeed in the following decades. So let me begin by saying that the time that we're living today is no longer a climate crisis. The UN has called this a climate boiling. And many people have also argued from a scientific standpoint that the biggest challenge we face today is that we're not going to get, by 2030, to the target of stabilizing the world climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this has a tremendous implication for companies, implication for households, implications for civil society, but most importantly, to the future of cities. We're going to see more cities affected by the rise in sea levels. We're going to see how more people will be affected by extreme temperature, and that will put also a lot of pressure on the healthcare system. We will see, for example, how a specific infrastructure will be affected, and by that will also affect the consequences of logistical deployment around the planet. And yes, we are now struggling with why are we at this point and how are we going to face it. So this is not just a moment of trying to contain the crisis or the challenge, but how are we going to adapt and adapt fast. And I have to say this because the amount of natural disasters due to the effects of climate change have basically skyrocketed in the last years. We have seen years with the highest amount of hurricanes, category 5. We have seen also amounts of melting in most of the mountain corridors of Latin America and the Caribbean. We have seen a great damage in the polar circle, and the Arctic contribution to this crisis has also affected the life of many species. And if we put this also in the context of biodiversity, we have to say sadly that we have lost almost 70% of the world's wildlife in the last 5 decades. And if we look at a specific hotspots that we have in this hemisphere, we have lost the size of Germany and France together when it comes to Amazonic land in the last 4 decades. So this is a moment for us to reflect why cities matter so badly in the way we're going to face this climate boiling. Cities are the epicenter of the climate crisis we are suffering. And they are the epicenter because that's where most of the negative effects occur, but also because many of the policies that are needed today for adaptation have to take place in cities with the right planning and with the right public-private partnerships. Just to give you an idea, the amount of waste that it's been put every day in the cities of the Western Hemisphere are no longer going to be faced with traditional measures because we don't have more landfills, and landfills should not be a solution. And there is a dramatic need in order to pass from that waste to sustainable solutions like energy generation. But as far as we're speaking this morning, only 2% of the cities in the Western Hemisphere have already planned dynamic, fast solutions for waste management in a non-traditional way and an intelligent way for the next 20 years. And that is something that requires us to act, and to act immediately. So we have to see this as a domino effect. Kenichi Omae used to use a phrase that said, let's think globally, but let's act locally. And we need to start acting locally and triggering a domino effect, positive domino effect, in which the actions from the government, from the cities, have an impact on all the sectors that are involved in the economic life. And that requires for us to change the chip. And that chip requires that cities see their own living as a true conviction to protect biodiversity. We're here in a city like Miami that has a tremendous potential to become one of the leaders in the Western Hemisphere as a biodiverse city. Not only because the amount of green, but also because it's close to very important coral reefs, and also because it's a place that is connected to ecosystems that have unique endemic species. And how can a city impact positively biodiversity? How can a city put together a framework that becomes a reference model? And how the private sector can do well and do good by putting together this idea? What you're seeing here in the screen is something that has been launched in the city of Barranquilla in Colombia, and it's the Ciénaga de Mallorquín has built this very unique park so that citizens can come and identify unique species and work for their protection. But the message behind this is, if cities decide to protect at least 30% of their territory, and that doesn't mean that this is going to be conflicting with the development of an economic life, but if cities protect at least 30% of the hotspots that surround them, they will be guaranteeing sources of water, they'll be guaranteeing mechanisms for cleaner air, and they will also make the citizens become biodiverse citizens that are knowledgeable enough on how their own individual carbon footprint can affect their life in our society. Obviously, a society and a city that works as a biodiverse city requires to have clean transportation and clean mobility. And that's the second component. We have to protect the green heritage and the green assets, but we also have to think in mobility in a cleaner way. And we have to think that electric vehicles are part of the solution, but also urban massive transportation are part of the solution. And even the way we plan the density movement of the population inside a city can determine if we can substantially reduce individual carbon footprint and emissions. So clean mobility is a great opportunity for public-private partnerships. If we have a better use of transportation, and I'm not only talking about conventional, but unconventional, and if we reduce the amount of kilometers that a regular worker has to use every day to go from point A to point B, especially in the working force, we will be changing substantially the emissions of one of the main sources of the climate crisis, which is the amount of unnecessary hours of transportations that are used with very intense fuels that have an impact on the climate crisis. But also, the way cities are planned. How are we planning the neighborhoods? What's the green density per neighborhood that we have to maintain? What are the kind of materials that we want the constructions to use? How can we bring the sectors that are difficult to abate in terms of carbon neutrality to identify solutions? And how can they also put before society a call for massive investment? This is something that is also required from the perspective of a biodiverse city. And it's not difficult because we're seeing now, for example, in Miami, that the amount of companies that have signed net zero commitments to 2030 has tripled in the last 5 years. So if we use the right accounting and we also involve companies to participate in reforesting, conservation, and protection of a specific green spots in a city, that will also become a successful business partnership with the orientation of the state. Energy transition, which is also another component of a biodiverse city. How much energy are we using from non-conventional renewables? And how can we trigger the massification of non-conventional renewables? That requires to have auctions that are two-sided, where you have the buyers and the sellers, where we also provide incentives to put in a territory specific companies that will be able to produce some of these materials, and also how do we use recycled materials to be part of this aggregated value chain. I had the possibility in Colombia to provide an orientation to the market. We didn't want the government to be the one who was leading this specific sector, but we set the rules. And we were able to pass from literally 0.2% of the energy matrix in non-conventional renewable energies to almost 14% in less than 3 years, because we gave the right market signals. So this is a possibility for cities to call for two-side auctions, try to connect the excellence of energy to the grid, and try to create also in households the sentiment and the optimization possibility that through solar panels during the day, families can also get their own energy, but they can connect the excellence to the grid and have a discount on the tariff they regularly pay. So energy transition is also a key component of biodiversity. Waste to energy. Waste to energy is also one of the biggest bets we need to embrace today. The amount of waste that we're generating, it is simply not going to be possible to manage it in the traditional way. And that's where plasma solutions with incineration, with gas capturing, and a double use of the captured gases make a lot of sense, but this also allows to provide in all the corporate environment and in the household environment the reuse, reduce, recycle optical approach, so that since the early stage of the aggregated value chain through the transformation, this can generate income, can generate energy, and can reduce the negative impact of waste in our society. Reforesting and river protection. We don't regularly talk about this in a way where we're connecting these two approaches with the sustainability perspective of a city. A city that increases the density of trees and that has a better protection of rivers is going to allow the protection of its citizens from severe pain derived of high temperatures. In the healthcare system, people don't list deaths out of extreme heat because there are pathologies that are triggered by extreme heat. But if we were to measure extreme heat as a cause of deaths, it's one of the fastest growing causes of deaths in the planet. And if we have a larger density of green coverage in a city, we will be adapting to the reality of high temperatures and we'll be protecting the lives of many. So this has to be seen as a sustainable investment in the way we plan our cities. And the same thing happens with rivers. We're very close to have one of the most extreme Niño phenomenons in this hemisphere, with very troubling derivations when it comes to the effects on the supply of energy, and also consequences that the rise of temperatures, especially in rural areas, are going to allow transmissible disease to grow very fast. So the protection of rivers, the sustainable management of rivers, the cleaning of rivers is also one of the key components of a strategic infrastructure for biodiversities. And let me tell you, the amount of investment in this hemisphere when it comes to the cleaning and protection of rivers has, on average, remained stable in the last 5 years. It needs to increase, and it needs to bring more players, and it needs to be part of the overall strategy of the public and the private sector together. And this also comes to the conversation on how are we going to build better infrastructure, and how are we going to call the sectors difficult to abate. Primarily when we talk about aluminum, when we talk about iron, when we talk about cement, we need those industries that are very critical in the way we deal with the climate boiling we face, but to bring them with a strategy so that they can reduce their carbon emissions and contribute to have more efficient buildings that have less pressure on electricity and that are more sustainable in the way we use water and in the way we also put pressure to other set of systems that are integrally connected. This is how tax plays a very important role. Tax policies for companies to accelerate this transition should be considered. We shouldn't be shy about that, because it's the best way to accelerate the industrial transformation. I remember in 2018 when we said to the Colombian people that we were going to reduce corporate taxation in order to allow a transformation, a strategic transformation in the industries, then we got a lot of criticism. They say, well, this is a president that just wants to give money out to the corporations, and this is going to trigger more fiscal deficit, and this is not going to allow the economy to grow. Well, in fact, what happened was that we reached the lowest fiscal deficit in almost 8 years. We increased our tax collections by 30%, and we doubled the economic growth. Why? Because the way we created those tax discounts was strategically connected with this type of investments. So we said all the VAT tax that is paid for capital investments is going to have a deduction of 100% on that VAT. Well, that allowed to transform the industrial base. We also said we were going to discount 50% of local taxes, and that also triggered more investment when it comes to carbon neutral policies, but also scientifically based industrial base and industrial technology. And last but not least, it also allowed the economy to trigger more employment. So this is a fast transition for green jobs. So this sustainable infrastructure plays a key role. And the circular economy as well. Companies need to see that greening is not a cost. It's an opportunity. And many of the green policies that are embraced can either be part of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, or simply green bonds where you can get a greenium based on transparent and integrated accounting that allows your stakeholders to see how the investments are made. And green finance plays a very critical role. We have to say that today, the great challenges that many cities feel in Latin America, in the global south, but also in the global north, is that the transition requires a lot of investment, and that investment is not coming just from the support of the central governments. And even when it comes to the issuing of debt, there are high levels of indebtedness that don't provide the adequate fiscal space that cities are needing. So guarantees Carbon credits are going to be the most strategic source of doing it, but it also requires the right accounting. We definitely have to see better, more transparent, and feel that there is integrity in the accounting of what is sold as a carbon credit. But there's no mechanism that can, in the agility that is required, at the pace that is required, to mobilize most of these resources. And we need to make biodiversities places where the carbon credit economy is vibrant. Without that, we're not going to be able to mobilize all the resources that the private sector requires, that the public sector requires, and that society requires. And this is simple. The footprint that the biodiversities require is based on a composition of elements in which every single part of that chain generates value. And that is possible if we understand that there has to be the concept of market-driven, nature-based solutions. When companies, households, and the government have this vision where from recycling to waste to energy to sustainable transportation to better density city planning and also the incorporation of new sustainable materials are all in place with the protection of rivers, this reduces not only the NDCs for a city, but a city can present itself in competitiveness with other cities saying, you shall invest in our city because our city has a lower carbon footprint than these competitors that we have. It's a transparent way of saying that a dollar invested in a biodiversity, it's a morally responsibly deployed unit of capital. And that is connected also with the idea that with the concept of biodiversities, we will be able to achieve the sustainable development goals. Obviously, this is not going to happen, unfortunately, by 2030 because primarily of the effects derived from the pandemic. But we are certain that biodiversities, with all these units of capital that we have explained this morning, can make a city achieve these goals faster. Not only reducing the debts at early stage or expanding the life expectancy or reaching carbon neutrality or integrating women to the development of new green jobs in the economy. This vision is the one that is going to allow us to say that there's no economy that can grow and generate this transformation without a clear connection and conviction to the market economy, but with a market economy that has an environmental moral responsibility. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know this morning you're going to talk about infrastructure in cities that is connected to this green element of vision for the future. And I am inviting you this morning that all the infrastructure that a city like Miami requires, and most of the infrastructure that cities in the Western Hemisphere require, if they are connected with a vision of biodiversity, we are going to substantially make a difference. We are lagging. We are lagging from our ambition towards 2030. But we have to act, and act promptly. And biodiversities are the best way where we can think global and act local. Thank you very much.
I'm Norberto Quintana. I'm a banking and finance partner at Holland. I'm delighted to be here with you and in the company of this panel. We have real leaders of organizations. I'm going to introduce them in a minute. To bridge the presentation from President Duque into the topic of our discussion, a couple of data points. More than half of the world's people live in urban areas, and that figure is projected to rise to 68% by 2050. Cities, including their public transportation infrastructure like airports and ports, are vulnerable to climate-related risks. The urban built infrastructure exacerbates climate hazards. Buildings and roads, for example, absorb and re-emit the sun's heat, causing what is known as the urban heat island effect. Poorly planned infrastructure, such as paved over streams, can interfere with water drainage. In the modern urban cities, infrastructure and its operating systems are all closely interconnected. A failure in one part of a network can cause an effect on the other, causing disruption. Flooded roads, for example, can damage links to public transportation, and storm surges and extreme heat can lead to power outages that knock out technology systems critical to homes, hospitals, and industries. Cities, and with them the public transportation infrastructure like airports and ports, are vulnerable, in part because they are located most often in risk-related places like coastlines, floodplains, and islands. For instance, 90% of all urban areas are coastal. By 2050, 800 million urban residents could be affected by sea level rise and coastal flooding. In addition, 1.6 billion people could be vulnerable to chronic extreme heat, and 650 million could face water scarcity. To protect the lives and livelihoods of urban residents, cities, including their public transport infrastructure, among other aspects, must improve their resilience and become more and more sustainable. Creating such sustainable and resilient solutions in cities can have a tremendous positive impact, because cities are consuming 78% of the world's energy. They account for more than 60% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the United Nations, and the urban transport alone accounts for about 40% of the transport sector's total emissions, according to the International Energy Agency. As a project finance lawyer, I get to work on projects that address these issues one at a time. But here with me, we have leaders of the industry, of our political life, and of our large infrastructure operations that deal with these challenges on their daily basis. And so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves one at a time. But in your initial remarks, I would ask you to discuss briefly what type of natural or environmental risks your organizations face, and what it means in that context to be sustainable or resilient. And so we'll start with you, Audrey. Audrey Robat, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for USA Canada of ENGIE North America.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Audrey. I am exactly the CFO for ENGIE in North America. For those who don't know ENGIE yet, we are an international energy company based in Europe, operating gas infrastructure assets, developing and operating renewable assets, wind, solar, battery storage, working on green gases, hydrogen, biomethane, and operating in partnership with cities and CNI customers to develop and build and operate their infrastructure. So indeed, we have been in this business for 150 years, and so we saw a tremendous change in our exposure towards climate change, or the effect of climate change on our infrastructure. They are getting more and more vulnerable to increasing risky environmental risk. I mean, we are exposed to hail when we develop a solar farm. We can be exposed to flooding when we are operating a large hydro dam. So that's only a part of the large issues that we face. And so how we try to tackle it is to incorporate environmental assessment and thorough risk assessment at the very beginning of the project, so at the design phase, when we operate, when we maintain, and planning about the dismantling on it. So that's really a comprehensive assessment of our value chain all over our projects.
Thank you. Frederick Wong, Jr., Deputy Port Director at PortMiami.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Wong. I'm the Deputy Port Director at PortMiami. And just a point of privilege, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been in this industry for approximately 29 years. I started out here when I was 18 years old. I was raised here in the city of Miami, and I had the privilege to serve under our former port director, Bill Johnson. You know, he saw a glimmer in a young man's eye running through the operations, and he gave me that chance, and here I am serving as the deputy port director at Port Miami. With that being said, Port Miami, we are the 10th largest seaport in the nation. We are the #1 international container port in the state of Florida. We are the cruise capital of the world, still standing, and it is an outstanding number when our audits are finished as far as our cruise passengers. And we have 1.1 million 20-foot equivalent units for the 8th year running, over 1 million TEUs of cargo. We are in the middle of the supply chain, and there are many concerns as far as sustainability, environmental footprint. Being a port and a port of entry, it is always important to ensure that we work in concert with the environment and still allow commerce to come in and out and flow freely through our region. So we're concentrating a lot of our efforts in reducing our footprint and ensuring that there are other available fuels for the maritime industry as well.
Shelley Carroll, City Councillor for Ward 17 at the City of Toronto.
Thank you. Good morning. I suppose I'm sitting on this stage when I listen to the other profiles because of the work the City of Toronto has done and is doing. We have always capitalized on unfortunate learning experiences. I could go all the way back to the 50s in terms of biodiversity that we've been talking about this morning, and really climate change adaptation and mitigation. I can honestly say that in a policy context, it started before I was born. In the 50s in the City of Toronto. That was when we had our first wake-up call as a major city in an extreme weather event. It was called Hurricane Hazel. And we began then to start making strict policy around how we were going to protect ravines that were at that time sort of just built around and then built too close to. We just sort of laid down our sewer infrastructure, and it all resulted in deaths and a lot of property destruction. So before climate change was even a term that had been coined, Toronto began to build that sort of policy. And then in the same year as Hurricane Katrina, my first term, I should say, as a councillor, we experienced a flood not as devastating as Katrina, but part of the same storm system and darn close. In my own ward of 44 wards across the City of Toronto, in my own ward, I had 2,500 homes whose basements were filled with sewage, and that played out across the whole north end of the city. And then we began in earnest to make sure that capital work always had an adaptation lens on it, particularly in water services, but that is now extended to green building standards. All of our infrastructure work is looked at in that way. Where we have federal incentives to green fleets, et cetera, we take advantage of all of them. It's true we probably have the deepest pocket. We're kind of without peer in terms of the size of our city in Canada, but I can honestly say that because of the collection of incentives from federal to provincial and then to municipal governments working together, a lot of the work that should be ongoing is ongoing, and people who answer our calls for tender know that and actively build it into their proposals.
And finally, Ken Pyatt, Deputy Director at Miami International Airport.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Pyatt. I'm the Deputy Director of Operations for MIA. I've been with Miami-Dade County for the last 13 years in my role, and prior to that, I worked for American Airlines for 37 years, so I have about 50 years in the aviation industry. The efforts at MIA to incorporate sustainability into our master planning go back to the 90s, when we realized very quickly that we needed to incorporate into our capital planning projects that would protect MIA against stormwater flooding. For those of you who recall, this past spring, we had a 2-day rainstorm where Miami got about 9 inches of rain and Fort Lauderdale got about 27 inches of rain in one day, which shut that airport down for about almost a week. I mean, I guess the good news is we got all their passengers, so I can't complain, but certainly that's something that we want to prepare ourselves for. So in the last 20 years, we've incorporated drainage programs into our apron refurbishment, our sewer drainage programs. Utility corridor links are protected against water intrusion, and retention ponds that will absorb water. Our last CIP started in 2019, and we further extended our protection by relocating taxiways RS&T so they would not be in a flooding area, and the relocation of MIA's West Cargo fuel tender facility so that it would not be prone to flooding. The airlines just approved 3 new projects, and again, they're all with an eye towards preventing stormwater flooding. The additional 6 gates in South Terminal, which we call Concourse K. The west extension of Concourse D, which allows us to realign gates and add additional gates to the concourse, and D60, our regional carrier facility for American Airlines. All of those have sustainable projects in there that are geared towards reducing flooding at the airport.
Fred, I'm sorry, you were speaking about how busy PortMiami is. Although being one of America's busiest ports, PortMiami has been honored by the North American Marine Environment Protection Association with the 2023 Marine Environmental Protection Award in the ports category for the sustainability practices and initiatives. Recent conducted sustainable measures are, for example, all-electric cranes, which replace diesel-powered equipment, and electric rubber tier gantries in the cargo yard that reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 20%. Could you give us a short overview of the measures that have been part to this success?
Yes, thank you. You know, when you talk about ship-to-shore gantry cranes throughout the nation and throughout the world, a lot of the ship-to-shore gantry cranes, they are diesel-powered. And PortMiami, we started our initiatives back in 2011, as a matter of fact, where we ended up pulling out all of the diesel engines out of the ship-to-shore gantry cranes. We ended up reconstructing our entire dock with electrification, Panzer belts, so we can accept gantry cranes with full power and electric. And right now, PortMiami has 13 ship-to-shore gantry cranes that are fully electric. None of them run on diesel. In addition to that, as far as our densification into our cargo yards, we have 18 ERTGs, electric rubber tired gantries, that are moving all of the containers from the gantry into the container terminals on full electricity. But not only is it on the cargo side, but we're taking a lot of initiatives to reduce our carbon footprint on the crew side as well. So in the first quarter of next year, we're going to end up having the capabilities of shore power. So who here knows what shore power is? Shore power is for vessels. All right. Yeah, you don't count, Richie. You work at the port. So as far as shore power vessels, when the vessel comes alongside, they end up plugging into our local grid and powers the entire cruise vessel. So think about that. A floating city, 1,100 feet long, turned on its side, and it's powering up for 6,000 guests and 3,000 crew members on shore power, and they're on our grid. So in the first quarter of next year, we're going to end up having 5 cruise terminals outfitted with shore power, but as far as the local demand, only 3 cruise vessels can call on that power at the same time. So it's tough. We're going to talk about some challenges as far as, you know, moving forward on different kind of energies and some of the challenges that we're facing with electrification. But shore power, that's one of our main initiatives. Additionally, we're rehabbing our entire wharf. Our wharf is the dock where all the cruise vessels come alongside, not only for end of life, but we're going to end up sustaining because we're going to be raising our seawalls 10 feet above sea level. We're going to expand our dock an additional 45 to 53 feet to the north into the channel. And this is all for sea level rise as well. So, different initiatives as far as densification in the cargo yard, electrification for the cruise vessels, and with all of our new constructed cruise terminals, building management systems that are smart systems that control HVAC, LED lightings, the whole 9 yards, adding technology into these cruise terminals for the day-to-day operations.
I'd like to go back to Ken. Miami Airport has been voted Sustainable Cargo Airport of the Year by the readers and subscribers of Freightweek magazine last year, 2022. And in particular, speaking about energy and energy sustainability, I would like you to please tell us about the FPL project, which was named the largest energy conservation initiative in Florida and one of the largest energy performance contracts ever undertaken in Florida.
This is a project that I'm very happy to talk about. We had a partnership with FPL Services, which is a division of Florida Power and Light, whose sole purpose is to work with governments and corporations to reduce their energy footprint. And what they did is they did an analysis of our usage of electricity, our usage of HVAC, our water usage, and then came back and installed about $45 million worth of different hardware. For example, low-flow water faucets, new technology HVAC components, low-energy lighting, and as a result, they were able to save us $4 million per year off of our electrical bill for the next 15 years. That's a $60 million savings over that amount of time. And just to put that in context, that's enough savings to power 4,800 cars for 1 year. We saved enough water with our water management program to fill 16 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And more importantly, the project eliminated the use of R22 refrigerant, which is a harmful chemical that's often used in refrigeration. Also, it eliminated the presence of mercury vapors completely at MIA. Now, that was phase 2 of the project. Phase 1 started in 2018, and that is generating more than $40 million in energy savings through 2032. So we're very proud of that partnership that we have with FPL. And the most important part is the savings to the airlines, because any time you result in a savings of this magnitude, it comes right off of the bottom line of the operating cost of the airport. So the airlines, who are the ultimate guarantors of our financial existence, benefit from that as well.
Audrey, I'd like to turn to a different aspect of energy sustainability. In one of our prior conversations, you mentioned the using a mixed sourcing of energy sources to improve the resilience of our grids, our distribution networks. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about the challenges that come with that, and taking into account the energy market regulators and the private sector interactions, what it takes to get there?
Yeah, sure. Actually, as an energy company, what really matters first is security of supply. And being notably based in Europe, we saw it at the beginning of 2022 with the war in Ukraine and the sanction towards Russia. Germany was very, very heavily exposed to Russian gas. And the shortage of gas for them was really detrimental to the economy and leading to basically bankruptcy of their large energy player. So when we think about this security of supply issue, what comes first is being able to have the most diversified energy mix as possible, which means in terms of energy sources itself. Obviously we can think about the new kind of energy, renewable energy, being wind, being solar, being geothermy, being biomass, being waste to energy. There's a bunch of them. But we talk about energy transition, so we also know that it can't make it all until 2050, most probably. So in between, incorporating in the energy mix, natural gas and nuclear makes totally sense. So we tend not to oppose those kind of energy. There is not completely the old world and the new world, and there is a coexistence to manage. And to prepare for the upcoming new energy that will pop up, like biogas. I mentioned it. It's already happening, and hydrogen tomorrow. And this is why we also tend to say that the best infrastructure might be the one already existing, and how we can upgrade those infrastructure to make them compatible for the future of energy. So we are working on transforming our gas infrastructure to inject biogas, to inject hydrogen, for the time being as part of a blend, but tomorrow it will be fully renewable gases. We also have to upgrade the power networks. That's very important, especially here in the US. To get resilience, to cope with the kind of consumption pattern that was just described for the port. I think what is important today is the load and how we can manage the load. And so in terms of tariff, we will have to think about new kind of structure to pay for this capacity, rather than for, should it be the molecule or the electron. And there is also how we can have both centralized and decentralized infrastructure, and there is no opposite between both, but obviously the world developed with a very centralized energy scheme, having more local and more local infrastructures supported by local stakeholders like cities, or serving commercial and industrial customers like a port and airport make really sense, and it also drives leveraging on more local resources.
Thank you. Shelley, I want to have you talk to a question of how the experience turns into action in the political process. And so if I remember correctly, when we think about, big situations, big disasters that affect big cities, we all, for instance, affecting the energy space, we think about the big freeze in Houston a few years ago that, was completely unexpected and it left the grid completely out of operation for days. If I remember correctly, there was one situation in Toronto where the mayor had to call in the army to clear the snow. Is that right?
Yes, and throughout his life, he never again was able to live that down. We've since figured that out. We haven't ever had to call in the army, but we have had to adapt to those types of events, because as we know, it's not really global warming, it's global weirding, and so you just don't know what's going to happen. The flooding that targeted my ward and others was happened in the month of August. It actually happened in the same week as Hurricane Katrina. Snow can happen anywhere from November to February in those types of volumes. But what we've had to learn is how do you clear responsibly? How do you adapt the streets so that you can do it? We've had to figure out if we're going to make part of our mobility plan adding cycling infrastructure everywhere. Now you've got to figure out not just snow clearing but snow removal, because you can't leave the bike lanes inaccessible for months at a time. And so we're moving out of separated bike lanes. But if you're going to remove snow, remove it to where? And how do you do that responsibly? Is the environment leaving that snow clean enough that you can deal with that? Well, we are really lucky that we have preserved our ravines as much as we have in the city of Toronto. We are a city of ravines and valleys, and what that has left is area where you can actually work that out. And so, long time ago, we had a wet weather flow environmental plan began, then a stormwater management plan that looks at basement flooding and also withholding. Wherever we can, we're using holding tanks, either underground or above ground, and they become a part of every area. As we go in to look at renewing water infrastructure, we look at what are the adaptations we're going to do while we're here? What are we going to have to hold stormwater, be it snow or rain, and then take it forward to water treatment plants? We're a port city of a kind as well. We're a Great Lake port city, and that Lake Ontario with treatment is a source of water for our city and Chicago and every city in between that sits on those Great Lakes. And so we have to be stewards of that, and the two major rivers that flow into it, Humber and Don, travel through the city. So getting rid of industrial effluent flow into those rivers meant making policy for the private sector, and then updating all of our stormwater infrastructure that said just dump it in the river and send it to the lake. That's no longer an easy option. We have to be responsible about what we dump into that lake. And so we've had to move from those events to what is a safe and environmentally sensitive way to get through these events, and actually acted very quickly because we got our wake-up calls very early. People are now saying to themselves, oh, we seem to have an extreme weather event every year. But for us, the weather event we had in 2005, that was a wake-up call. I was lucky enough, so I was the most affected ward, and I happened to be chair of Public Works at the time. We also had an extremely forward-thinking mayor at the time. And so while our financial position, Canadian cities don't have the same financial formula that American cities or really world cities of our size, we don't have that same funding formula. But we had a forward-thinking mayor that said, no, we're going to go to the residents and we're going to say to them, because of extreme weather and the fact that more of it is coming, we can't wait. And we have to band together and decide this is going to be a livable city, and we're actually going to act on this. And so, in a very bold move, he said, we have taken advantage of our size in Toronto for too long and undercharged for water. And so what we did was say, you're going to pay an increase of 9% a year every year for the next 9 years. You have to catch up with everyone else. You have to pay what it costs to do climate change work. We had a similar strategy for commercial entities. But in the case of commercial entities, we're a city of breweries. And so in their case, we said, you'll also have to pay the increases unless you develop your own conservation and withholding plans on site, and they did. Obviously, it made more sense for them, and so we were able to mitigate very quickly. Today, we still have those extreme weather events. A very extreme ice storm in 2013 that took out power, but the melting of it didn't cause us a problem. And another couple of extreme events during the COVID years when it might have been hard to service them. And yet all of the work we were doing in that area from 2005 up to that point meant that across the city, rather than thousands and thousands of personal property floods and city street floods and major thoroughfare floods on our road network, we had about 10.
But Shelley, just to complement that, that has the City of Toronto made formal commitments to sustainability, like joint international declarations or whatnot?
We have. There have been times where we have been the leader and the outlier who proceed, and then the province builds policy around it. But we also are situated in a country where a huge amount of support is coming from the federal government. In the Association of Municipalities for the whole country, we have a thing called the Green Municipal Fund. So smaller cities that wouldn't have our pockets but need to do this work, they can get low interest financing vehicles through something called the Green Municipal Fund that is run by that Association of Municipalities, and a tremendous amount of greening of infrastructure and even greening of municipal buildings has been able to happen across the country. So they have strong policy. Ontario has often taken, oh, that's an interesting thing they're doing in Toronto. We will make that provincial policy, and we might even add to it. And that's happened many times. We have a green building standard that, while it started in Toronto, it became a provincial policy and was indeed beefed up a little bit. And it's deeply embedded in the Planning Act now. And so it's easy to turn to residents who say, these tall buildings are bad for the environment. We're honestly able to say to them, these buildings have a lower footprint than your single family dwelling. I'm making it Tier 3 district energy system. They're actually safer than your house. And it kind of shuts down NIMBY.
So you brought the conversation in the direction of my area of expertise, how these things get paid for. And so maybe I'll start with Ken. These projects, any of these projects we're talking about, building power transmission networks, new runways, new seawalls, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. And planning long-term billions, and when you do it at the global level, many trillions of dollars. There's no one size-fits-all solution for all projects. Can you say maybe briefly a word about what's the view in terms of financial planning, how you look at big projects and how you look at funding?
Sure. When we develop our capital plan, we have an office in the county that was created by the mayor called the Office of Sustainability. All county departments are required to submit their plans through that office and come up with a sustainability resiliency plan even before bidding out the project. Now, a lot of times the cost of this is baked into the capital project, but I think the Office of Sustainability is a good thing because it kind of puts a level playing field across the county. So just to give you an example, County Ordinance 7-65 requires that any new building built on county property be run through the Office of Sustainability with a plan to make the building sustainable going into the future. There's a resolution, County Resolution 58-17, that says all new roofs in the county and at the airport must be what they call a cool roofing system. Okay, and again, we're in the process of redoing our roofing right now, and we're going to make sure that the products we use in the creation of that roof will meet those standards.
Okay.
So,
Can I say a follow-up to that?
Sure.
It sounds like we're all building great policy. That the next step is the pace, because when you speak to cost, the hundreds of millions of dollars, that's the final frontier, is admitting to ourselves how fast we need to do this work. We did an infrastructure study for Canada to understand across Canada what's the backlog for cities, and terrible wake-up call and a news cycle that lasted 3 days of Canadian cities have $123 billion of infrastructure work to do, and it needs to acknowledge transformation in its execution. And we all wrung our hands about it, and governments made policy so that transformation would be part of it. All orders of government, and cities included. But then a follow-up study was done in 2016 to see how we were doing. What was the progress report from that 123 billion? And by 2016, it was 328 billion. So we, this country that had its infrastructure boom in the 60s and did so much in one decade now has, 70-year-old infrastructure that needs to be transformed and renewed. And that's the final frontier, is not the policy of how we do it. It's how fast can we do it, and admitting to ourselves that we need to come up with the ready cash to do it.
Okay.
And
Fred, I wanted to ask you particular, I was going to go to you next, is for those of us who have lived here or come here often, we have seen the skyline of the port change over the last few years. A beautiful site now. I understand that there's a significant amount of private participation in both in the design and in the financing of the new terminals. Can you speak about that and your experience with PPPs?
Absolutely, and I'll piggyback because PortMiami and MIA, we're enterprise departments of Miami-Dade County. So we do not take any taxpayer funds from Miami-Dade County. All of our funds are derived from our revenues, our long-term contracts through our container terminals, our cruise partners, and our long-term leases. So just so we're clear, as far as partnerships is most definitely key. From 2021 till present, PortMiami was awarded $146 million through the federal and state governments. And that may sound like a lot through the years, and it was most definitely humbly accepted. It is a small portion of what is needed in capital infrastructure for a maritime port operations or an airport. So partnerships are most definitely key to succeeding and trying to achieve sustainable goals. Our cruise terminals, as a matter of fact, we're building one of the largest cruise terminals in the world. Conventionally, you would have a cruise vessel, a terminal, and then a parking facility. With this MSC build of AA, AAA, and berth 10, you're going to have 3 cruise vessels, 1 terminal, and 1 parking facility. And the terminal is going to be upwards of 500,000 linear feet and square feet. And our parking garage is going to be upwards of 1 million square feet. So when you talk about those dollars, it's important to know and understand you have to have long-term partnerships with our cruise and cargo partners throughout the years.
Thank you. Audrey, I was hoping to get you to speak about your view of PPPs, but we have very little time, and I would like to transition to talk about the future. And Fred, you just shifted in that direction by talking about what's coming. If you can say in 1 minute, one of the projects or the things that you think about when you think about the future and making the operations more sustainable.
Oh, the new frontier here in the US is definitely battery storage. We just invested $1.6 billion in a developer and operator of a battery storage in Texas and California mainly. And I talked previously about the need for reinforced power networks infrastructure. In between, battery storage can really provide those kind of capacity services, frequency services, being able to charge and discharge this renewable power when it is produced and to deliver it when it is consumed. So that's really the kind of project that concentrate our investment today.
That takes me to Ken. You just mentioned power batteries. The aviation industry is talking about battery power planes or hydrogen power planes. How does an airport adapt, and can an airport do it by itself?
Well, those are the things that keep you up at night. Your question is a good one because the future is a big paradigm shift for airports in the way airplanes are going to be fueled going forward. And while some airports are further ahead than others, at the end of the day, if 2 airports don't share the same system, the airplane can't fly from one to the other. So it's important that we prepare now by talking to other airports and coming up with programs to work on gaining minimum standards for fueling and the type of fuel that we're going to accept now, so that we'll be ready in the future. When the A380 was first introduced, airports had to modify their taxiways and their gates in order to accept the aircraft. And when we were told we were getting the A380, we had to do the same thing. Otherwise, the A380 wouldn't fly here. So it's the same thing with fuel. These new types of fuels are amazing shifts in the way the operation is conducted, how you bring the fuel in, how you store it, how you dispense it, completely different than from today. So in my view, as an airport, we need to reach out to our sister airports where we have service and start talking about what that's going to look like 8 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now.
And Shelley, I would like to close with you. You've spent a lot of your career thinking about education. What's the role of education in making our way of life more sustainable?
We have a great relationship with the two major school boards, the public and the Catholic in Toronto. I hope it's true of other municipalities, but right down to things like, if I look at, we did a major rerouting of a stream that was part of our source waters, runs through my ward, and was eroding in the ravine. We basically had to, turn off the creek and pipe the water to redirect while we rebuilt the stream's direction and really made it into a new and beautiful water course, but also one that would have the right amount of meander and the right amount of flow to get us out down to Lake Ontario. That's a pretty crazy thing to do, but our relationship with the TDSB is such that the first thing that came to mind is, there are 2 elementary schools within range of this project. So it became a year-long field trip that we're going to bring the kids over and show them what it means to turn off one of nature's streams, and they're going to follow the project. They're going to do something on it in class, and then they're going to come back and see the finished product. And God helped us with that project, because I went out to join them literally on the day that we pulled out the last of the equipment, because the thing was in place, beautiful, gabion baskets making this creek flow, and some of the trees planted, and we brought the kids down to celebrate the finished product. And you worry about biodiversity, as we were talking about early. Literally, as the last truck pulled out and we were standing there with the kids, we looked up the stream to take a picture of them with it in the background. And a deer was standing at the top of the frame looking at us like, "Are you done yet? Can we come back?" And that was such a teachable moment for kids. And it's because we have this relationship that says whatever we are doing with regards to the environment, it seems like big and not educational really to an elementary school kid, but it was. That made a huge impression. And that means that for that kid, doing this kind of big infrastructure work that we have to do isn't scary now or for the rest of their lives. They're never going to forget the fact that they watched these giant Caterpillar tractors root around in their stream, and nature came back.
Wow.
I love it. I think that, the future, building a better future, starts by teaching our youth that there's a sense of possibility. Well, hopefully you will leave after this panel with a sense of possibility and a lot of questions about the challenges ahead as well. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for this wonderful discussion, and all of you. Thank you.